Hi everyone, welcome to this Make a Medic video on approaching MRCP PACES. It's the third and final part of the MRCP diploma, which is essential for all physicians intending to pursue medical training in the UK. It's a practical examination that can seem intimidating at first glance, but I firmly believe that with the right preparation and resources, you'll be able to ace it. Just a brief introduction about myself. My name's Lasith Ranasinghe. I'm the founder of Make a Medic, and at present I'm an ACCS anaesthetics trainee based in London. I sat the first IELTS of PACES in 2024 and was given a score of 166 out of 168. I'll be the first to admit that with any performance-based exam like PACES, there is a huge amount of luck involved in terms of the patients and examiners that you will encounter. However, I do also believe that there are a few key principles that I applied to my preparation that helped me perform well on the day. And I'm going to share all of this with you in this video. So I found that when I first thought about sitting PACES, the advice that I received was quite fragmented. So I didn't really know how to start or how to progress. I've therefore distilled my approach into a series of steps so that you have one objective at a time to focus on. Bear in mind that there will obviously be some overlap between these steps. For example, you don't have to wait until you've finished watching the Pastest videos to start examining patients, but hopefully listing it in this way gives you a clearer framework with which to get started. I've also provided some estimates of how long each stage can take. So obviously there'll be some variety in this because everyone has different amounts of free time, but I'm hoping this gives you some guide in terms of how much time you should leave yourself to complete each of these different stages and in general to prepare for PACES. First of all, I'd recommend that you familiarize yourself with the format of PACES. The structure of PACES changed in 2023, however it remains a circuit of 5 stations as shown by this carousel. The exact structure of PACES is beyond the scope of this video. However, in the description I've linked a comprehensive article that I recommend you read to get to grips with the structure. It just takes 10-15 minutes to get through the article, and it'll hopefully give you a better idea of exactly how it's structured and what you can expect on the day. I'm briefly going to go through the marking of PACES, so I wouldn't worry too much about the exact numbers. I'm only doing this so you have a better idea of what you really need to focus on when preparing. So there are 7 domains listed A to G that are tested across the 5 stations in PACES. Bear in mind that not all the domains are tested in every station. For example, identifying physical signs won't be tested in the clinical communication station. For each domain within a station, you will be given either 0, 1 or 2 marks as listed at the bottom right of the screen. For example, if the examiner thinks that you have identified sufficient physical signs in the respiratory station, they will give you 2 marks. To pass PACES, you need to pass each individual domain. The pass marks are listed on screen. And you need an overall score of at least 127 out of 168. This can initially seem a bit daunting and confusing, so I decided to simplify the mark scheme for myself and focus on a few key domains. I personally argue that 3 of these domains, C, F and G, relate to general conduct around patients, and as long as you're comfortable communicating clearly and sensitively with patients, it's not something that you would specifically need to prepare for. I also interpreted domain E as being quite closely related to domains A, B and D. In other words, if you were to perform the examination confidently, identify physical signs and provide appropriate differentials, you're likely to have shown good clinical judgment. Furthermore, the domains that are most frequently failed are identifying physical signs and differential diagnosis. Therefore, I decided to focus my attention on these domains. Again, I would reiterate that you should read the article in the description about the structure of PACES and how it's marked, but the overarching point that I'm trying to make is that you should focus primarily on physical examination, identifying physical signs, and differential diagnosis. Next, we move on to committing the examinations to muscle memory. The 4 main examinations should be your priority. However, be aware of the fact that some examinations like thyroid, hands and fundoscopy could crop up, particularly in the clinical consultation station. The key point I make with this step in the PACES plan is that you should not overcomplicate it. You would have learned all of these examinations at medical school, and the routine really isn't any different for PACES. I committed 2 evenings at the start of my preparation period to practicing the examinations over and over and over again, with Geeky Medics open on my laptop and a makeshift model in my room. After which, I felt like I had refreshed my examination technique from medical school and was able to perform them without having to think too hard about the steps involved. So that's something you can do quite easily. If you have someone who can, be your dummy for you, that's even better. But it really doesn't take too long to rekindle that knowledge of how to perform a proper examination. So don't fret about it too much. Just do it over 2 or 3 evenings. Just do it over and over and over again until you feel quite confident that you can perform it without having to think about what to do next. Right, moving on to the Pastest PACES video library. Just a quick disclaimer, this is not a sponsored post, but I have recently done some work with Pastest to help develop some resources to aid MRCP preparation. That being said, I had used their resource bank and sat PACES long before I engaged in this partnership, and I do firmly believe it was my most useful resource. They have an enormous library of videos that I would recommend getting through at an early stage. It's best to start with the examination technique videos that showcase the gold standard examination technique for each of the main exams, and this is something that would be helpful during step 2 of the PACES plan. Once you are happy with your examination technique, move on to the patient cases. There are over 100 videos of real patients with physical signs, including heart and lung sounds. The videos include exemplar presentations, vivas, and case critiques from the examiners. A lot of people tend to go through these videos slowly and save them up until they get closer to the exam date, but I personally went through them early and went through them twice so that I was familiar with the types of common presentations that often come up in PACES. It's the next best thing to seeing patients in person, and it is much more accessible. I would also note that the level of detail demonstrated in the vivas for these videos can be quite exaggerated, so don't be too alarmed if the questions that the candidate is being asked seem very complicated and esoteric. Though it can obviously vary depending on the examiner, most stations will only have enough time for a few quite predictable questions on the most likely diagnosis, relevant investigations, and management. Let's move on to sign hunting. It's important that you try and see, feel, and hear as many physical signs as possible before the exam. A lot of people spend a lot of time trying to form PACES groups, arrange convenient times to go around the wards together, and even get hold of elusive consultants who have at some point offered PACES teaching. Though it can of course be useful having patients identified for you, being watched whilst you examine and present, and being quizzed afterwards, you should also capitalize on any downtime you have on work days to go around by yourself. When I was preparing for PACES, there weren't very many others in my hospital sitting at the same time, so I ended up doing a lot of practice on my own, and this turned out to be incredibly valuable. If I had a quiet moment on a work day, I would screen the ward notes and create a list of the patients with known signs. I would then go around with this list and examine all of these patients. The focus of this exercise was to become very familiar with the scars and sounds that commonly arise in PACES, without having to wait for anyone else to go around with me. So these are some of the relatively common PACES cases that you should look out for when screening the ward notes. I've also made a Google Sheet template of conditions that can possibly arise in PACES that you can tick off as you hunt for signs at your hospital. The link to this Google Sheet is in the description. I would also reiterate that you'd want to focus on making sure that you're familiar with the common types of conditions that come up in PACES. So on the list that I've made, there will be a few things that are super niche. You're probably quite unlikely to find them in hospital. And by extension, given that they're quite rare, it's probably quite unlikely that they're going to pop up in your PACES as well. So make sure you don't value each of these conditions in equal measure and focus on the stuff that's generally more common, like what's on screen right now. So to summarize, please do seize opportunities to go around with others and get feedback where possible, but do also capitalize on the free time that you have by yourself to examine patients and become familiar with various signs. Moving on to knowledge for the Viva. A lot of people get quite stressed about preparing for the Viva. However, I would reiterate that much of the time the questions asked will focus on differential diagnosis, investigations, and management of the case in question. In my opinion, PACES is primarily a test of performance and interpretation under pressure, rather than a test of knowledge. That being said, I did create a Brainscape deck of flashcards that was constructed primarily using the Pastest videos and some background reading from the books on screen. The link to this Brainscape deck is in the description. I've used Brainscape for pretty much every exam I've sat since medical school, and I believe it's the most powerful learning tool out there. I find that it's the best way of consolidating the knowledge by performing all this spaced repetition. And I would recommend downloading Brainscape onto your phone, accessing my free PACES deck, and flicking through it whenever you have any free time. There are also a few books that get mentioned, such as Cases for PACES and Pocketbook for PACES. I personally didn't find these particularly useful, and I certainly don't think it's something that you should read cover to cover. It can sometimes be useful for reference if you want to know more about a specific condition. And finally, courses. I'm by no means saying that you need to do a course to pass PACES. They are very expensive, and there are plenty of people who have passed PACES without attending courses. However, as part of my preparation, I did attend the Ealing PACES course and found it very helpful. There are a number of PACES providers out there, but I chose the Ealing PACES course because it's run by Professor Karim Miran, who is widely reputed for his outstanding teaching and taught me at Imperial a few years ago. It was 2 days long and it was very interactive. I wanted to examine as many patients as possible, and there were around 80 different cases for us to examine. I also liked that they focused on the practical nature of PACES and gave us plenty of time with patients rather than expending unnecessary time in lectures. It's held at Ealing Hospital in London, and as of September 2024, it cost £950. I would recommend doing the PACES course towards the end of your preparation, perhaps around 2 to 4 weeks before your exam date if possible. By this point, you should hopefully have refined your examination technique and become familiar with most common signs. The course can then help you polish things up and ensure that plenty of the signs that could arise in your PACES are fresh in your memory going into your exam. The very final point I'd like to make is about avoiding PACES hysteria. I've anecdotally felt that a lot of people preparing for postgraduate exams like PACES can psych each other out by relaying horror stories and fixating on pass rates. Though it's easier said than done, it's important to have your own personal plan when it comes to preparing for PACES and doing your best to stick to it. This diagram is one that I find quite interesting. It refers to Yerkes-Dodson law, which describes the relationship between the level of arousal or anxiety and performance. You of course need to give PACES the respect it deserves and take it seriously, but try your best to avoid falling into doomsday conversations with others who may be sitting the exam or who have sat the exam in the past. You've got a plan now, so get started and I'm sure you'll do very well. Thank you for listening, and please do subscribe to support our charity.